Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Accelerator event. I'm Deandra Rose. I'm the Director of Research for Polis, the Center for Politics at Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy. And on behalf of Director Mac McCorkle and the entire Polis team, I welcome you to tonight's discussion of structural inequality, racial justice, and democratic citizenship. We're really excited to have tonight's discussion because it kicks off our new Polis Innovation Accelerator. This is an initiative through which we will grapple with a tough issue or set of issues every year, and that will shape our events and our workshops. And then during the spring semester, we will host a competition where students will have the opportunity to propose some policy solutions for the challenges that we're grappling with in events like this one. This year's themes are justice and citizenship in a time of COVID. And this fall, we're going to delve into these issues, starting off with events like this, but we're also going to consider things like mail-in voting and diversity in elected office. So we hope you'll enjoy, we hope that you will join us for those future events. And tonight, we're especially proud to kick off the Innovation Accelerator with tonight's discussion, and we're excited to team up with our colleagues and friends from the Sanford School of Public Policy's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. So we're excited that all of you have joined us tonight. And before jumping into our discussion, I'd love to take a moment to recognize and introduce our moderator. We're very fortunate to have Polis's own PhD fellow, Morena Martinez, with us tonight. Morena Martinez is a dual PhD student in public policy and political science here at Duke University. Her research focuses on the role that race and ethnicity play in adolescent political development, particularly in the primary and secondary school context. In addition, Martinez's research interests include K-12 education policy, identity politics, and American political behavior. Morena is an alumna of MIT, and in addition to her work and her research as Polis's graduate fellow, Morena serves as the grad fellow for the North Carolina Scholar Strategy Network, and she does many other amazing things. So please join me in welcoming Morena Martinez.
Thank you so much, Professor Rose. So as Professor Rose said, my name is Morena Martinez, and I have the privilege of also introducing our panel for this evening. So first up, we have Professor Jay Pearson. Jay Pearson is an assistant professor in the Sanford School of Public Policy and co-chair of Sanford's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. His research examines how policy-sponsored structural inequality influences social determination of health. He's particularly interested in the health effects of conventional and non-conventional resources associated with racial assignment, ethnic identity, national origin, and cultural orientations. A native of Hertford County, North Carolina, Pearson's early experiences in the rural agricultural South shaped his academic interests and informed his research agenda. Pearson holds a PhD from the University of Michigan, where he began his public health career as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras, where he worked on child survival. Next up, we have Professor Catherine Wetton. Catherine Wetton is a professor of public policy and director for the Center of Health Policy and Inequalities Research at Duke University. They're also the co-chair of Sanford's Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. Professor Wetton holds a PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Wetton's work focuses on the understanding of health disparities in the US and around the globe, particularly life course events and social environmental factors that influence health-related behaviors and well-being. The goal of their research is to provide empirical evidence to policymakers to improve systems of caring for marginalized populations. And last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Deandra Rose. Deandra Rose is an assistant professor of public policy and political science at Duke University's Sanford School, where she also serves as co-director of the Polis Center of Politics. She's a scholar of American politics and higher education policy, and her research focuses on the role that higher education and federal higher education policies have played in empowering marginalized groups in the United States. Rose holds a PhD in government from Cornell University, and prior to entering academia, she worked in Georgia and Minnesota politics. Thank you so much to everyone, particularly our panelists, for being here with us tonight. So to go ahead and kick us off, let's begin with the topic of structural inequality. So over the past few months, we've heard a lot about structural inequality. So Professor Pearson, can you tell us what is structural inequality?
Certainly. Thank you, Marina, for the question. Structural inequality, as we know it in the United States and abroad, is characterized by sets of social arrangements, relationships, and conditions which are informed by biased public policy decision-making and that manifest as stratified social hierarchies of differential human valuation. These social hierarchies are systemically advantageous to majority population groups while being simultaneously systematically disadvantageous to minority population groups. The majority-minority identity status distinction as pertains to structural inequality is not about demographic distributions or percentage of population, but instead about asymmetries in power, status, and standing, whereby social majority groups get to construct their own identities and then construct and impose identities upon minority groups in ways that minorities cannot in turn impose upon majority groups. Structural racism, as a specific example of structural inequality, holds that macro level processes associated with racial construction, racial hierarchy, as well as racial bias are central organizing features of the US that were established before its founding and that remain salient to the social order until the present. These are multifaceted, interconnected, and co-occurring phenomena. This means that structural racism is inextricably linked to US national identity. It pervades and suffuses virtually every major institution comprising broader US society and is consequently systemic. As such, it negatively determines the life chances and lived experiences of populations of color to the benefit of white Americans, far beyond individual acts of interpersonal racial discrimination, which is what most people think of when we use the language of racism. This is who we are. This is who we've been since before the inception of the nation, and current animated protest against overt dehumanizing racial injustice in the form of homicide against Black bodies notwithstanding, who we will likely continue to be without similarly animated policy changes in our political, economic, policing, carceral legal justice, and not least among these, educational as well as academic systems.
Thank you so much for that definition, Professor Pearson. Professor Rose, could you give us an example of how structural inequality manifests itself in politics and political participation today?
Absolutely. So, I would underscore and echo everything that Professor Pearson just said. And for me, when I'm thinking about unfair patterns that emerge as a result of institutional structures, I start to think about, this question of how do we grapple with inequality? So from one perspective, we can look at unequal outcomes, in terms of our lived experiences or the outcomes that we have in terms of, access to certain opportunities in terms of individual level abilities or circumstances. And structural inequality provides a framework for really grappling with that type of, with our experiences and our situations in a way that looks beyond the individual. So, for example, poverty would be conceptualized as more than just a result of individual level failures. It's actually thought of within the context of institutions. So maybe there are things that we're seeing in terms of how we order society that actually leave some people worse off than others. So to take a political example, we think about voting. So our institutions are set up in ways that make civic participation easier for some citizens than others. So it could be the fact that we hold elections on Tuesdays typically, and it might be really difficult for some people to actually take time off to go to vote. We might actually think about the hoops we have to jump through to participate in politics. So voter registration, for example, questions about whether or not we might need to bring an ID to the polls and so forth. And we could add additional factors here, but these are the questions that we're looking at. And in terms of how we explain inequality, a structural lens helps us to think beyond individual level situations, to think about how those institutions that Professor Pearson points to really matter for equity.
Thank you. So Professor Whetten, thinking about that, essentially we're living within a society in which systems are stacked against certain people. So what does that do to affect people's beliefs and actions?
Yeah, thank you, Marina, for that excellent question and for the opportunity to talk with everyone. I'm a population health scientist, and social science research, including some of my own work, very large studies, large populations, has shown that how we're treated as young people by society is a very large determinant of how we're able to trust systems. So we're talking about, and starting with young people, and I'm talking about society. So how does a young person experience society? What a young person is experiencing is they're experiencing how their teachers are treating them, how social service agencies are treating them and their families, how police, how people who are designed to protect and shelter them are treating them. They're looking at church leaders and members, perhaps how YMCA groups, other social groups that they're involved in, and even healthcare systems. And when young people see and perceive, even though they may not have the words for it and likely don't, that they're being treated systematically differently by this society, and they're watching how their friends and other people are being treated, and they're saying, there's something, no matter what I do, I'm not being treated the same way. When they perceive that their parents, their guardians, their loved ones are also being treated differently by these systems, and that their families, loved ones, aunts, uncles can't get ahead no matter how hard they work, they start and develop a profound distrust of systems that is very hard to change later on. So even if they know that this may not be because of structural, unequal, structural inequalities that don't allow their parents, their families, their grandparents to have had access to banking loans, to have had access to the GI Bill for education, to the Department of Agriculture admitted in the late 80s, not allowing Black farmers to get farm loans. So kids aren't understanding all of that. And as we turn into adults, we may or may not understand why it is that this system around us, where we are very acculturated in the US, there is this kind of has been up until recently drumbeat of if you work hard, you can make it here. But you see that working for your neighbor and it's not working for you. And you've seen that no one has helped to date, whether in policy, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, whoever it is, my life has not gotten better. So why in the world would I think that a Biden ticket would get me someplace different, or a Trump ticket would get me somewhere different? Why should I engage in this system that really has shown, if anything, it seems to be kicking me backward all the time? And I want to go back to what Professor Pearson was saying about systematic racism, and I want to quote a renowned figure here in North Carolina and nationally, Reverend Barber, just from this weekend. He said systematic racism is targeted at Black people, but it hurts all people. When police kill innocent people, it threatens the entire stability of the system. When racist voter suppression is implemented, it allows people to get elected who then enact policies that take living wages and block health care for all people. So racism can be targeted at Black people, but ultimately it is the destruction of our democracy. I believe it to be the most important thing in public policy in this nation and really around the globe, and we'll talk about that another time. And we have a profound tension right now between those who want justice for all people, regardless of their race, creed, color, and those who are bent on engaging and continuing this systematic racism, even when in cases they may not even know that that's what they're doing. And I'm just going to speak for another minute on intersectionality. what is intersectionality? That's where you have a combination of minority statuses that are coming together to affect the way the world treats you and the way where you perceive the world. So as a gender and sexual minority, I can say that even as a young person in elementary school, I knew that the rules and regulations of society around me were not made for me. In fact, they were against my very body, my very being, who I was, and I had no idea why. I had the experience of seeing the hatred in the eyes of children on the playground and knowing that I couldn't be protected. And this really affected my ability to trust any authority, including a policymaker, a doctor, other authority figures. Now imagine being Black and a sexual gender minority. Imagine being Black and Latinx and not even having the ability to self-identify who you are, the identities that you want to carry forward. We know that race is actually not a biological construct. We shouldn't even be using race as a construct, and yet we can't stop using it right now because our society has been created in a way where we have systematically defined and changed the definition of race throughout the history of this country.
Thank you so much, Professor Wetton. I think that also segues nicely into the next thing I want to talk about, which is over the last few months, we've seen this rapid social change in the United States and even globally. We're grappling with the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the contemporary civil rights movement, the rapid approach of the 2020 election, and the COVID-19 pandemic. So with all of these different things going on, how are you thinking about the current social, economic, and political moment?
Okay. I'll just respond briefly. Thank you. Yes, great question. In my hopeful moments, I think that we are going through a great awakening to what has been not new events, but literally an awakening to what it is like to live in this country as a minority, particularly as a Black person. And my hope is that particularly among white liberals, that that this is a time when we can take stock of what's happened, take stock in trying to figure out why we have not been adequately educated about the history of this country, about the structural inequalities that have been here, and that we can be angry enough and motivated enough and try to make a change now. Likewise, economically, I think understanding the economic structures that have been put in place here in the US and again in our global actings have also really come to light. And this has happened due to the murders of people around the country. But again, this has been going on for a long time. So my hope is that this is a time when we are open to dialogue, and there are so many fantastic researchers who have been coming forward, who have been writing for decades, who are now being read and understood, who have been talking about structural inequalities and the inequities that follow from those, and possibilities of reparations and things like that. So in my hopeful moments, I really hope that this is the push forward, that we can reach the aspiration. Our country has the aspiration to be democratic. I fully believe we have never had a democracy in this country, and that this might be a time when we could push forward and perhaps have a democracy. And just briefly, as a population health scientist, to focus on the COVID-19 epidemic, and that this epidemic, as with other indicators in the health world, really provides a lens into the inequalities that result in the inequities, the inequalities that result in the inequities that exist in our societal fabric, the very fabric of our country. And we can see this because of who it should not be, that an infectious disease such as COVID-19 would disproportionately affect any group that's defined by innate characteristics like race, or ethnicity, or other characteristics. Those should not be a factor. What it shows is that this is who we've put on the front line. this is who we accept as the frontline workers, so they're going to be at higher risk. And then with those same risk factors, we have higher comorbidities, and so we've got higher death rates. So kind of two different responses to what I think are two slightly different questions, but again, we can use that information to try and push this conversation forward and have change and not just conversations.
Thank you so much. Professor Pearson, how are you thinking about this current moment?
So I'd like to echo a point that the point that Professor Wetton just ended on, and that is that COVID-19 accelerates and exacerbates already underlying existing structural inequalities, particularly in the dimension of race. So this is nothing new. And in fact, I myself was slightly perturbed when folks in the broader population began to express surprise that this would indeed be the case. Those of us who do population health investigations, particularly racialized differences, predicted it, you know, as soon as this thing started. And so that's one point. The second point is in terms of, you know, the more recent racial justice movement. I was initially encouraged, but I've been paying very close attention to the survey research data on racial attitudes in the United States of America. And so we saw somewhere between a 14 to 17% uptick among white Americans in terms of their belief that anti-Black racism was a major issue in contemporary US society. 3.5, 4 months later, we've seen that thing slide back 12 points or so, right? And you know, that's pretty quick in terms of survey research data. I am firmly of the opinion that this is a function of relatively superficial interpretations of the nature of racism. That is, that it is interpersonal and that there are a few bad actors in terms of the police or maybe some private citizens who are perpetrating this, and an absence of appreciation for racism, again, as a structural and systemic mechanism, which I firmly believe is a failing of our educational system, right? We should all be getting taught this stuff from as early as we have social perceptions of difference and begin to construct in-group versus out-group and construct mechanisms that establish majority versus minority status, right? Without that kind of fundamental education and appreciation for the true history of the United States of America and how the system picks winners and losers, we will continue to see these kinds of upticks if there's a major event that sort of inspires people and causes outrage, or as my friend says, the woke culture, and then very quick retraction as soon as whatever the guilt ego is that's motivating folks to go out and put signs in their yards, but refuse to have the people who they're talking about, that is Black Lives Matter, live next door to them, right? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Rose.
I think I would just echo and riff on this idea of awakening. And for me, I think it was fascinating to watch this confluence of events that unfolded in the late spring and early summer, particularly in the US. But of course, more broadly, we saw this globally. But I think it was interesting to see the murder of George Floyd. And also, if you all recall, the situation in Central Park up in New York, where I believe his name was Christian Cooper, was watching birds, and he had this interaction with a woman, and he asked her to basically put a leash on her dog, and she refused, and she said, "Look, I'm gonna call the police on you. You know, don't tell me what to do." It was a loose paraphrasing of the situation. And it escalated. And I think it was something about seeing the video footage of that exchange with the woman telling this Black man, "Look, I'm gonna call law enforcement on you. Basically, you know what happens if I call law enforcement on you." To see that juxtaposed with the George Floyd murder. And then, I think the fact that many people were all kind of sheltering in place because of COVID-19, many of us are connected to our devices and the news outlets, looking at social media and other media particularly closely. I think that there was this interesting confluence of events and something of a synergy that has really helped to really drive this awakening that we're seeing in this particular contemporaneous moment. I think, as a result, we've seen that people have really focused in on not just the broader sort of political, policy-scape, political landscape, but also on our own communities and our own institutions. And so we're seeing, in universities nationwide, in Congress, in different institutions, we talk about structural inequalities, we talk about institutions as the drivers of that inequality. We're grappling with what equity looks like in these institutions and how we can reform our institutions to be more equitable and just. I think what's interesting to me is, as we think about justice, how we think about justice. So there's one thing to treat people properly, and to make sure that no people are, at risk of death, for example, because of their identity. But then there's the question of restorative justice. Do we owe people something? Is there something that we have responsibility to do in addition to, providing just some sort of basic equality in terms of lived experience? How do we actually address the traumas that certain populations have undergone as institutions, and to what extent are institutions responsible for doing so? How should they do so? So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of the current moment.
Thank you so much. So coming off of this idea of awakening and restorative justice, I want to talk a little bit about solutions and what they'd look like. So this past summer, we've also been hearing a lot about anti-racism as a necessary practice for combating structural racism. But what exactly does racial justice and anti-racism look like in practice? Professor Pearson.
Thank you for another excellent question. In terms of racial justice, I think of three components. I think that we all in a pluralistic society have a fundamental right to participate in negotiating the rules and regulations that govern the social contract that the government develops in relationship with members of a broader society. And so everyone who has a vested interest, everyone who is interested in securing their well-being, should have representatives at the decision-making table, right? In such a system, if we can conceive of and imagine its existence, you would then have no population group that reliably and consistently reaps the benefits of this society's successes. Similarly, you would not have readily identified, easily identified social identity groups that reliably and consistently bears the burdens of that society's failures, right? And the dimension of identity that we're discussing here is race. So that's what racial justice and those three dimensions looks like to me writ large. And what was the second part of your question? I'm so sorry.
Also anti-racism.
Anti-racism. So that's a complicated one for me. So I'll talk more about personal experience here than the actual research literature. And my sense of it is most folks very quickly, again, when I laid out the definition of structural and systemic racism, I made sure to highlight that we're not talking about interpersonal racial discrimination, right? And so again, this tension between folks believing that because they're not running down the streets saying white power or walking into grocery stores and following people of color around, that they are not themselves personally racist, right? And so great, feel good about yourself, but these systems, these structures, these institutionally enforced mechanisms that again reliably track populations into different opportunity structures and life chances and lived experience remain intact. And unless we're serious, we take serious the business of working through informed, responsible public policy decision-making towards dismantling those structural, institutional, policy-informed mechanisms, then we're not anti-racist. Those of us who are majority are benefiting from a fundamentally racist society. Those of us who are minority will continue to bear the burdens of the failures. And so that's for me, that's my conceptual take on anti-racist, an anti-racist agenda. It has to address the structures, the institutions, and those mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pearson. Professor Whetten.
And I would agree completely with what Professor Pearson was saying about racial justice. Representation is just key. We can't do it without having everyone at the table together and having equal power. So not having everyone at the table as there's one Black person who's going to represent Black people. We need representation and power and multiple people, and we need people at the table quickly who are making decisions, and we need to trust that can happen and that is going to benefit everyone in doing that. And I also personally believe that we do need to provide for and start, I'm going to say paying for, but we need to start accounting for the structural inequalities that that Black people have faced in this country, that have made it so that people have not been able to gain wealth, have stable employment and things like that. I'm not going to, others are experts in talking about what that looks like, but I do think that's got to happen. And cross other groups, can cross other groups also. With regards to the question about with anti-racism, I think just some concrete things that we need to be doing is stepping in whenever we hear anything that is anti-ism, whenever we see anything, whether our Black colleague is there or not, we need to stop the conversation. And there are different ways. Again, there are books out there, and people who have been working on this for a while, how we can intervene, in ways that have a positive outcome, that can be as simple as, what did you say? Or that doesn't, or can be, depending on where you are, more educational in that moment. And having difficult conversations with those of us, with family members that can be uncomfortable, and just starting to do that change. Talk with whomever you can. I think one of the filming of different actions has been really important. Our phones, with their ability to film, have opened up something new. So not everything about our new life with our phone in our hand all the time is bad. Education is absolutely critical from preschool on. In fact, from birth on, we know that that we as humans have a biological function of grouping people, and it served us really well long ago. You were able to quickly identify who's friend and foe, and you've got your group, and we're able to survive together. Well, we need for our infants even to be able to literally recognize and differentiate the faces across ethnicities around the globe. We need to be acting on that. So even from that stage, and then in our education systems, we need to be doing the same. We need to go through and look at our history books. Our education system in the US needs incredible reform. With our prison systems also, and the way we've treated them, and having prisoners who then aren't able to vote, people put in prison. There's so much to do there. Okay, so there's all of that. And then, as Professor Pearson was saying, our own structures, every structure that we live in, whether for me, I've got the Duke Global Health Institute, we've got public policy, we've got the community, where I live. We need to be working with all of those to create changes. And we need to be doing that work now.
Thank you very much. So picking up on this idea of engaging with the structures and structural change, I want to ask, what is it going to take to make structural change, particularly structural change that lasts as institutions shift and change over time? Professor Rose, do you want to get us started on this one?
Sure. So, I think especially for those of us who sit in schools of public policy, we spend a lot of time thinking about solutions. And so I think institutions like Congress, like state legislatures, like administrative bodies in institutions like Duke University and other higher ed institutions play a really important role, because we can make decisions that really shape access, that shape people's experiences within our institutions, and equity, like the extent to which people have access to equal opportunity and upward mobility. So I think that for those of us who think about policy, we recognize the opportunity that we have to actually fix a lot of the things that we've been pointing out. So the one thing I would say is that policy design is critical for lawmakers and other policymakers who have the opportunity to develop solutions. They ought to be doing this in a way that is attuned to the fact that, you know, demographics change, that political fortunes change, and that if you're trying to establish long-standing and enduring solutions to the challenge of structural inequality, it's going to require policy designs that actually enable other lawmakers to really focus in on that particular solution and to tend to it. So I think a number of the sort of structural inequalities that we see today that are rooted in policy failures are really, we can actually look at policy designs and see places where, for example, certain social policies are not indexed to inflation. So their power to support needier populations doesn't keep up with, you know, rising costs or the change in inflation. We also see that as demographics shift, oftentimes policies are not structured in a way to keep up with those shifts. And so in the political science literature, we call this policy drift. You know, it's this really interesting idea that policies really need to be kept up and tended to. So I would say, you know, for people who have the capacity, like if you're working as a staff member, a legislative staffer, you know, as an administrator, you have the opportunity to help develop solutions that have staying power. And then I would also say to really focus on implementation of those programs. So we can have, you know, the best ideas in the world, but if we don't allocate resources to maintaining those structures and those ideas, those new solutions, then they really can atrophy over time.
Thank you. Professor Whetten, do you have anything to add? Professor Pearson? Excellent. Okay, so I want to move on to sort of our last question for me, and then we'll move on to the Q&A from our wonderful guests. So this one's a bit of a meta question. So everyone on this panel is a member of Duke University, an institution of higher education. So for my final question, I want to ask, what role and responsibility do we have as members of an institution of higher education? Professor Pearson, if you'd like to go first.
So a couple of things immediately come to mind for me, and I think about the role of recruitment, and again, you know, this came up before, both Professor Whetten and I mentioned this, representation, and, you know, across at least 4 dimensions among the faculty, administrators, students, and staff. I think related to that, instruction and the content of Duke University's curriculum, I am firmly and increasingly of the opinion that no Duke University member, and not just students, but faculty, administrators, and staff, should exist here without a fundamental training in, understanding of, and appreciation for structural inequality, social justice, and representative relational equity. And finally, that if we take seriously the business of engaging these processes, we should reconsider how we engage the immediate community around Duke University. That is, Durham City, Durham County, and even the state of North Carolina. That is, I think it would go a long way towards addressing some of these issues if we could foster and promote the kinds of relationship and spaces where our broader community members could bring to bear authentic voice in their engagement and relationships with Duke University.
Thank you so much. Professor Whetten?
Yes, thank you. Very much want to echo fundamental training for everyone in structural inequality, social justice, equity. and hearing from the community. I also want to say, as a university, the faculty are our governing body, for better or worse, because most of us did not get our PhDs with a training in administration, and yet we are the governing body for so much of what happens. And so as we admit faculty, as we bring excellent faculty from around the country who are bringing the diversity of their lived experiences along with the incredible research that's being done, we have a problem in that we bring them in hoping that this will help change our university, but they then go on a tenure track. They go on a tenure track that lasts 7 years, could be a bit longer, then you've got a sabbatical year if you've made it. And the requirements of that tenure track are around the research that's done, which is excellent, and also at Duke around teaching. And I think that one of the things that we need to consider is that we need the people who we're bringing in because we think that they are excellent in their research and we think that they have a lot to give our university. I believe that we need to relieve them of some of the teaching responsibility and allow them to be on committees that are helping, just as Professor Pearson was saying earlier, we need people at the table now making decisions with us. We need to not wait 8 years. 10 years from now. Meanwhile, how many cohorts of students have left? And yes, that might mean that students don't benefit in this moment as much from that faculty member, but it means that in the long run, all the students are gonna benefit. So I think that, and that's one example of the way we can kind of break apart the way that we make decisions so that we aren't waiting decades to make changes that need to be happening now. So again, just one example of how we need to be moving the system forward more quickly.
Thank you so much. And finally, Professor Rose.
So I think I spend a lot of time thinking about higher education and higher ed institutions and the role that we play in helping to develop not just workers, but also citizens. And so for political scientists, we've recognized that people who have higher levels of educational attainment are significantly more likely to engage in political and civic activities. So getting a college degree makes you more likely to vote, to contribute to political campaigns, to volunteer for campaigns, to engage in protests. So in many ways, we provide knowledge and skills that open the door to political and civic actualization. So I think for us in institutions of higher ed, ensuring that we're offering broad access and that when we bring students to our campuses, we're really recognizing the responsibility of providing a living space for them and a learning space for them. So, this is the place where they learn, but it's also their home. So we need to make sure that everyone feels equally included, everyone feels equally empowered as full and equal participants in the space. I would also say, in terms of content, in terms of what we teach, I would just underscore, I think at a number of points in this conversation, we've talked about the significance of history. And so, we at Stanford have the great privilege of working alongside some of the best historians in the world. And it's really those insights from history that I think are critical for helping to ensure that everyone's on the same page about the problems that we seek to address with policies. So I think until we're on the same page about what the problems are, we can't really address solutions and develop solutions that will effectively grapple with them. So I think I couldn't speak more broadly to the significance of education and higher ed institutions in particular as drivers of democratic citizenship.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panel for helping us answer these questions and start thinking about big, bold solutions. With our last few minutes, I want us to be able to answer some questions from our wonderful audience members who've been here and seen this conversation and starting to think about things. So all of our participants should have the ability to type in a question if they have one into the chat, and it'll be sent to the hosts, and I'll relay them to our panelists. So if you have a question, take a moment to go ahead and type them into the chat. chat. We've already received one question, and that question is, how might we connect work against racial injustice, being an anti-racist, to participating in this election season? Is there a particular election project that is more anti-racist?
I think that's for you, Professor Rose.
I've got my thinking cap on. I love this question so much. I mean, I think, it's interesting. So looking at the last few months, statistics have shown that young people in particular are significantly more likely to report that they're feeling awakened, and that the recent events, things that have happened since March have really helped them to understand how significant politics are to their lives. And so, one of the biggest opportunities, I think, in this particular election cycle is whether or not we will harness that energy and momentum from young people. So I think that if I were to pinpoint one place, to really direct a lot of energy, it would be to making sure that young people have the information necessary to make informed choices at the polls. And that, I think from research from our colleague, Professor Sunshine Hilligus, and her co-author, a Stanford PhD alum, John Holbein, they've shown that it's sort of these subtle worries about misunderstanding or lacking full information. A lot of young people just don't want to mess up. They don't want, to go to jail because of voting. So they hope that they can know, exactly what they're supposed to have. Should they have an ID? Should they not? You know what? I don't know. I'm confused. I'm going to sit it out. So I think efforts to really promote understanding and clear information, that's one place we sorely need attention. Another interesting question has been about the age of poll workers. And we know that typically people who staff polls tend to be more senior members of our communities. And because COVID-19 disproportionately affects in particularly disproportionate ways our senior communities, there are questions about whether young people can really pitch in at the polls. So that's another place where I would say, if you're really hoping to do your part to promote democracy and anti-racism, to make sure that all voices are heard, consider getting involved in those ways too.
Thank you so much. We have another question that I think is fantastic and sort of looking for some action items for our participants today and members of our community. How can we make sure that social justice, specifically racial justice, is a movement and not a moment?
So I'll take a swipe at this one. I'd like to echo a point that both Professor Whitten and Professor Rose made earlier, and that is the value of history and helping people to understand that, we didn't just magically arrive at these moments, that there's historical inertia associated with what we're seeing, or this latest manifestation of racial injustice. I suspect, I'm not sure what the evidence is on this, but I suspect that grounding people or citizens, residents of the nation, in that history may very well allow folks or help people to be more amenable to, receptive to the current historical moment. And I'm not sure that we always do a good job of helping young folks and sometimes old folks understand history and the weight of history. For instance, in terms of Black American ethnicity in the United States, roughly 83% of the existence and interactions with the US federal government has been under direct, overt, government-sanctioned oppression, right? That's heavy. That's heavy. So.
The question made me think about the way that I set up our research projects from a policy perspective. So what I'm always thinking about, just because of the way we set up these projects, is you're always thinking about what policy questions are we answering and where is this going to sit in the long term? And it occurred to me in listening to your question that that's often not what we do in the moment here. We do set up, we think about this month and we think about next month, and can we have a rally that's going to be, in DC in February? So we think ahead, but we're not really thinking about where do new systems live? Where do new structures live? Or how do we embed ourselves in structures that provide for explicitly from the beginning that this is going to be a 30, 50-year haul? And these are the things we need to do over that time period. I think we've done that maybe in some of our legal organizations, but in terms of a population, in terms of a movement, gearing people up for that, we have not done that well. So I do go back to thinking about history and kind of combining it. That's a really great idea for how we move forward, is to start getting people to think about this. Okay, this is what we want to do right now. We have an election coming up, but what is it? How are we going to keep this going? And start planning for it now.
I think if I could chime in and just add one final thing, I think just as we're talking about structural barriers, it's really building into our structures, into our institutions, those solutions. So creating some space, creating a new position. If you want to make sure that attention in your organization doesn't waver away from anti-racism, put somebody on your team whose job it is to spend time thinking about that.
Yeah.
Build into your culture. If you're building a panel of speakers, if you're setting up your events for the year, if you're selecting your cohort of scholarship recipients, make sure you're building in spaces for those who are historically marginalized, those with intersecting marginal identities, because I think that's really the place to make difference. And if we institutionalize, again, kind of like building public policies, design policies in a way that helps us to come back to this question of, hey, is this anti-racist? Hey, is this equitable? Doing this also in our institutions, that's the way to make sure that it's more than just a moment.
Thank you so much. So we're running short on time and we have some really, really phenomenal questions coming in. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but there is one that I want to end on because I think it comes from a unique perspective. So we had a student submit a question and pointed out that we've talked a lot about educators, policymakers, administrators, things that they can do to sort of break down these institutions, have a seat at the table. But for young people, for Duke students, what can they do to make a difference in anti-racism besides just going to the polls?
It's an interesting question. These young people have done so much in this moment, from filming, from being brave enough to put their films out there, and that is scary, to leading protests, and then I think as we move forward to making sure that voices are being heard as decisions are being made, as well as working within student groups and doing all of that. But I am really hopeful and encouraged by the activity of young folks today. I think Professor Rose, you said this earlier, I think we are in a unique moment. This happened decades ago, but right now this is a unique moment. And I would actually take the moment to say thank you all for all that you've been doing, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
All right, so on that note, thank you to everyone who came out tonight to enjoy our panel. Thank you for all your wonderful, thoughtful questions. Please keep them coming. This is a conversation that we want to have as a part of the Innovation Accelerator throughout the entire year and beyond. It's clear that there are members of our community that are really thinking big about what concrete actions we can take to make real change. And so that's fantastic, and I applaud everyone. And I want to say thank you in particular to our wonderful, wonderful panelists. It was incredible to get the opportunity to talk to you and hear you guys think. You're brilliant and wonderful, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Rose to wrap us up now.
Thank you so much, Marina. And I just have to thank you for just fabulous moderating. We are so grateful to have you on the Polis team. And everybody, I have to brag on Marina for just a second. Marina has really driven the development of the accelerator. So tonight's events and the future events that you'll see as a part of this set of programming is really like Marina's handiwork. And so we're so grateful for her brilliant efforts. I would also like to thank Professor Wett and Professor Pearson. We're so grateful for your wisdom and your insights always, to the Duke Sanford Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, to the Sanford School of Public Policy, to the entire Polis team. A number of the Duke Sanford Polis Directors Fellows are in the house, and they did an amazing job helping to organize. And to all of our audience members, I have to say, I see a number of familiar faces in the house and names and people coming from all across the country with us tonight. So thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you next time. For more on our programming, check out polis.duke.edu, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks so much. Take care.